So, let's start by talking about the early days of D&D. Think back to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, to those funky, fragile hardcovers you borrowed from the weird uncle who kept his books perfectly preserved since the late 70s. Back then, the monster manual had clear moral authority. Goblins? Evil. Demons? Super evil. Mind flayers? So evil they didn't even want your soul. They wanted your brain. You could set your dice on the table and know, with total certainty, that every dungeon crawl was a righteous crusade. You were Conan. You were Gandalf. You were Luke Skywalker. And there was no ambiguity. Evil was something you could see, smell, and run through with a longsword. Now the funny thing is, even though the earliest D&D campaigns borrowed a lot of DNA from Tolkien and from Howard, those stories were still pretty murky. Theoden was under Saruman's control, and Boromir was a good guy with a sword. Even the orcs, despite being doomed by the text itself, had lines of dialogue and half memories of light. Howard's Conan stories were a parade of gray. Bloodthirsty conquerors, mad priests, rich merchants with more bone in their basements than meat on their tables. These were stories of grime and sinew, where the line between hero and villain was a smudge. And even the monsters could be pitied, if you looked at them long enough. The text of the Monster Manual itself had no time for cosmic ambiguity or existential muddle. From the moment that glorious cover greeted you, fiendish dragon looming over a pile of skulls, and the font winking with the secret handshake of nerds everywhere, you were assured that its contents would be, if nothing else, decisive. There, within those pages, the universe was ordered with bureaucratic zeal. Creatures were sorted, stamped, and filed away into their respective moral cubbies. Each entry was a small act of creation and condemnation. Blink dogs, lawful good, always yapping at evil's heels. Displacer beasts, chaotic evil, all tentacles and malice, and no one ever wondered what they looked like as kittens. Demons, devils, ogres, kobolds, even the rare and faintly tragic gelatinous cube, all were damned in perpetuity by a single entry on the stat block. Their fates determined before the first D20 was ever shaken in anger or in hope. You saw a goblin, and you didn't just know it was evil, you knew it with a certainty usually reserved for the chemical composition of water. Evil was just what they were, down to their hit dice and armor class. There was a kind of chilling comfort in it. The world, or at least the game, ran on the engine of easy answers. You could cut down a dozen goblins per session and never once consider the possibility of a goblin spouse waiting at home, or a goblin poet scribbling verses in a flickering torchlight. They had no culture, no ambiguity, no reason for being outside of the next encounter table. And their only story was the one you told with your dice, how quickly and creatively you could make them not exist. The only real question was whether you dispatched them for treasure, for glory, or simply because the module said 2d4 goblins, and you happened to roll high. It didn't stop at goblins either. The Monster Manual's strict alignment calculus extended its merciless taxonomy to every being you could imagine, and even a few that you really couldn't. The moral scaffolding was, in its way, a kind of parody. By the time you reached the letter M, you'd already internalized that mind flayers were despicable monsters. But it would still take you another 60 pages to find an entry that suggested even a glimmer of nuance. The universe inside those covers was a place of total preemptive judgment, and your only job as a player, your singular, blessed purpose, was to see the monsters for what they were and to end them as efficiently as possible. And in that preordained violence, something weirdly liberating happened. You didn't have to worry about the small print or the moral footnotes. You could just be a hero, or at least a killer with plausible deniability, because the game said so. The world outside the game was so complicated. Bullies in the lunchroom, parents who fought after work, and the growing sense that maybe the people who ran things didn't know what they were doing after all. But inside the Monster Manual, things made sense. The evil was always conveniently labeled and slightly shorter than you. There was no patience for the messy, compromised world of the Conan and Tolkien stories you loved. Everything in those stat blocks was as crisp and clear as a snapped bone. But as I've gotten older and wiser, D&D has also grown up. Alignment isn't the great divider that it used to be. There are exceptions to every rule, outliers to every society, friendly dragons and evil little hobbitses. The nuance has become more important, almost like the movie A Perfect World, where the villain is on the run from the good guys. But as you watch the movie, you begin to like the criminal and the lines become blurred. Everything is gray with nuances of light and dark. Life is like that. And as I've grown up, I've found more room for nuance in the game. And I believe the game has backed away from alignment. Compared to the early years, alignment is barely used anymore, at least by the players. Only the creatures and villains seem to care all that much, usually in the form of immune to magic from non-evil weapons, or something similar. And even then the goalposts have moved tentatively, as if the designers themselves are afraid someone will shout, "Hypocrisy!" and chase them through the digital marshes of the forum boards. These days, characters are complicated. They betray, not just out of greed, but out of love, out of ambition, or out of confusion. Whole gaming groups embrace, like a favorite t-shirt full of holes, the idea that even their noble paladin might one day torch a village in a moment of crisis, or at least debate long into the night whether that village really deserves saving. And this makes for great storylines, great arcs of adventures, and even just great characters that the players will remember. The game is evolved to include the gray. And while I do miss the simplicity of the old days, I can't go back. Those were simpler times, and the game reflected that. But life is more complicated now. What do you think? Am I completely off base? Were the old days better? Let me know in the comments below. The world is gray, but the tavern's still open. Pull up a chair and tell me all about it.